folks wonder, what is it that God wants? Because God's a little testy about some issues there in the preceding passages. And Micah 4, God says, I have told you all I want is this last part. And yet you seem to keep making it complex, or you become confused, or all that kind of stuff. So throughout the year, we're going to look at a variety of things in both daily life, in religious practice, and in music, of how we have either overlooked the obvious answer or reinterpreted it for our time, or any something like that. My job just right at the beginning is to give you some idea about music. And so music in Christian worship has two purposes: praising God and teaching Scripture, or tenets of the faith. Now, in the early days, we have this fellow Augustine, who comes in about a little bit, a couple hundred years past the time Dr. Wansink will speak. So when we finish this, you'll blink your eyes twice, and then we'll be back to year 0. But he was a theologian and a philosopher, lived in northern Africa, and he called music the pleasure of the ear. And he felt that the pleasures of the ear were very dangerous because they could overwhelm common sense. Some of you I've seen dancing and know that to be true. So he thought for worship, safeguards should be implemented, and he even considered banishing all melodies from Christian worship. This is old school PowerPoint. So in his mind, there were two parts to music: the words, which involved reason in the mind, and melody, which involved the sense. In his world, as a theologian and philosopher, the mind was the greater thing. It was far greater to reason than to act by your senses. And yet, he determined that music was much stronger, and it could overpower reason, and that was what made it so dangerous. He said it inverts the proper order of things. And so for him, it was a dangerous thing. And from that time on, in Christian worship for about the next 1,000 years, music is basically chanted. The Psalms and other sacred texts. So no wild melody, no rhythm. Nothing should move below the waist. Because we didn't want this sensorial part to take over. So, blink twice, and now we'll welcome Dr. Craig Wansink, who will talk about early Christian.
Sandy, could I ask, indulge you, or have you, could you just pass these out? I don't know enough. If you know someone you might share with, that's fantastic, that's great. Irish step dancers, they move only below the waist, don't they?
Yes.
Yeah, that's kind of uncomfortable. I anticipated that there'd be about 15 people here, and so this is going to be very, very different than I sorry.
We've never been here, 15 people.
With what shall I come before the Lord is the key line we're going to be focusing on. It's going to be focused on a little less than 20 minutes. I'm sort of rapid fire. I'm really looking forward to Dr. Malone. He's going to have a PowerPoint presentation, so I'll try to hurry. This morning, I'm really only discussing a case study, maybe 3 case studies, or maybe only 4 case studies I'm going to discuss. Maybe 6 case studies. Just to get some insight into the worship of the first Christians. The first challenge that we're going to face is that frequently we do not discuss what we do. We just do it. So years from now, historians are going to be looking back and you're going to read a text that says Ronald Reagan shook the hand of Margaret Thatcher. And they're going to see repeated references to that kind of action. But the reality is that there are very few discussions of what's involved in actually shaking hands. So like the notion of Ronald Reagan shook the hand of Margaret Thatcher might be the image that they have because they don't exactly know what's going on. The same challenge we face is when we talk about, or when we look at early Christian worship, we don't have much discussion of how they did so. So this is what we do know. The first Christians saw themselves as Jews. First Christians saw themselves as Jews, and that's this starting place. So Jesus absolutely saw himself as a Jew. Paul saw himself as a Jew. He never talked about being converted. That would be a modern sense. He talked about himself being called. First Christians saw themselves as Jews. They started as a Jewish sect. They used Jewish writings, and they had Jewish expectations. They saw as what was happening in their faith life as a natural continuation of what had happened before. But the reality is some things clearly had changed. And one thing that had changed is that Gentiles, or non-Jews, were being incorporated in this group. And so a couple of things had to change right away. So what was one question with Gentiles? Whether or not they are circumcised. Yeah, whether or not they have to be circumcised. That was a question that was thrown out. Another question similarly was whether or not they had to follow kosher. Yeah, follow kosher. So those were two big discussions that needed to be negotiated. And what I want us to do today is actually talk about how in other ways did worship change? How did worship change in concrete ways? But what characterized the worship of the first Christians, again, is going to be discussed through cues and clues. So we're going to look at a couple of texts where worship is described only incidentally. So right now you may look at my outfit and you might say, hey, part of this presentation I'm talking about ancient Christianity, but part of what I'm doing is I happen to be wearing clothes during this presentation. And you might say, wow, those clothes tell us something about the fabrics that were used in the year 2013. And that's fair. That's probably fair. But if that's how we're understanding the fabrics of the year 2013, we aren't going to get, of course, a full view on this. And so part of what we're doing is we're going to be looking at some ancient Christian texts. We're going to be getting some insight, but they aren't discussing specifically, or they aren't always discussing worship in specific ways. So here we go. With what shall I come before the Lord? We're going to look at three texts right away. We're going to look at the Gospel of Matthew first. We're going to look at 1 Corinthians, and we're going to look at Pliny's letter to Trajan. The Gospel of Matthew is chapter 6. It's from the Sermon on the Mount. First, Jesus has, in the Gospel of Matthew, there are 5 big teaching sections. That's because Jesus is being presented as a new Moses with the 5 books of the law. And the very first big teaching section is called the Sermon on the Mount. And in the Sermon on the Mount, he shares this. So this is an abbreviated version, upper left-hand corner. Beware of practicing your piety before others in order to be seen by them, for then you have no reward from your Father in heaven. In other words, don't show off, because then God isn't going to reward you. So whenever you give alms, and whenever the offering plate comes your way, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and the streets, so that they may be praised by others. So when you give money, don't shout a trumpet. Whenever you pray, do not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, so they may be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they've received their reward. And whenever you fast, do not look dismal like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces so as to show others that they are fasting. Which is great. I love that image. I used to be, years and years ago, I used to be a long-distance runner, and I had one goal, and that was to always smile when I ran, because so many runners looked angry at the world. But all three of these function the same way. They all say, what does it mean whether you're giving alms or praying, or whether you're fasting? Don't be looking for praise. If you're looking for praise, you've got that. That's your reward. But ultimately, you need to approach worship with humility and not hypocrisy. So with what shall I come before the Lord? Humility. That doesn't tell us a whole lot about worship. It tells us a little bit about the attitude behind worship, but it doesn't tell us specific things they did. To talk about specific things, it might be good to look at 1 Corinthians. This is Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. It describes some practices. Most of the practices are no longer around. One of the practices, or if they are around, maybe not in your particular congregation or worship that you're familiar with. He ends this particular letter, I did conclude this, he ends this letter by saying, please greet one another with a holy kiss. As a very common practice, we tend not to, most people I should say, Christians tend not to do that. It was some of you know this before from other contexts, a holy kiss, what Christians gave to each other. It was not a kiss on the cheek, it was not like a Paris kiss, it was like a French kiss, it was on the open mouth. And so you might look around more carefully to figure out who you're sitting next to in church. It was seen as a passing of the Holy Spirit. So just as when Adam was created in chapter 2, God breathes life into Adam, and then Adam is enlivened. And similarly in John, the end of the Gospel of John, after Jesus is resurrected, he breathes on the disciples. So the passing of the Spirit is a way to move things on. That was seen as an important worship. The other things that Paul describes in worship are part 1. Any man who prays or prophesies with something on his head disgraces his head. But any woman who prays or prophesies with her head unveiled disgraces her head. It's one and the same thing as having her head shaved. And again, it's probably my sense is that some of you have been in places where women have prayed or prophesied without anything on their heads, so this might seem a little outdated or a little antiquated to you. And what Paul's doing here, I'll just give you a quick explanation, is there was an ISIS cult, worship of Isis in the ancient world. We know women shook their heads, hair flying everywhere. And we know that the men who followed the ISIS cult shaved their heads. And Paul is saying here, do things orderly. Women should do this. Second thing he says about worship, he says, so then, my brothers and sisters, when you come together to eat for the Lord's Supper, wait for one another. If you're hungry, eat at home. Again, make yourself a sandwich if you're hungry, but you can't just come and start downloading food. That's inappropriate. And then the third thing he says, third in worship, is 1 Corinthians 15. Wow, that's so wrong. It should be 1 Corinthians 14. I apologize. Some of you are familiar with, if I speak in the tongues of men and angels but have not love, I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. Any of you ever heard that before? Yeah, that's 1 Corinthians 13. What do you then go on to hear about in that chapter? Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, love's patient and kind and so forth. Yeah, and you've heard that phrase in some respects. If I speak in the tongues of men and angels but have not love, I'm a noisy gong. You hear about that frequently at weddings. It introduces this other scripture. But the reality is that passage was dealing with speaking in tongues. It says some people are speaking in tongues, they think they're better than other people, and Paul says, no, that's not the case. Be loving. Love is patient and kind. So it goes on and says, that's not the right page. It goes on and says, what should be done, my friends? When you come together, each one has a hymn, a lesson, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. Let all things be done for building up. If anyone speaks in a tongue, let there only be two or at most three, each in turn. Let one interpret. But if there's no one to interpret, let them be silent in church, speak to themselves and to God. Let 2 or 3 prophets speak, let the others weigh what is said. So in each of these cases, what he's saying is, first case, women, do things decently in order. Secondly, eat before you come. Don't eat out of turn. Do things decently in order. Don't speak in tongues unless there are people to interpret. Do things decently in order. And it's no surprise that the last verse is summarized. So, my friends, be eager to prophesy. Do not forbid speaking in tongues, but all things should be done decently and in good order. With what shall I come before the Lord? Well, Matthew would say humility. Paul would say, with what you come before the Lord, whatever else happens, it should be decently and in good order. It should not scare people. It should be. I think I'm just going to skip the third text. Well, let's peek at it for a second. This is just because it's so interesting. Pliny's letter to Trajan. Pliny was a governor. He lived in Pontus, Bithynia, modern-day Asia, modern-day Turkey. And he was the first governor in this area, and he didn't know what to do because there hadn't been a governor there previously. And so he wrote lots and lots of letters to the Emperor Trajan, trying to get advice from him, and Trajan wrote him back. We have a beautiful letter correspondence, series of letter correspondence that makes professors of Roman history, it makes their pocket pen protectors just jiggle. And in this case, Pliny is trying to persecute Christians. He knows they're around. He knows that they should be illegal. But what's going on? So he decides to torture some of them. That's legal. He decides to torture them and get them to tell him what's going on. What I think is so interesting about this is here we have the first outsider discussing worship. He says, the Christians asserted that the sum and substance of their fault had been that they were accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn and sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to a God, and to bind themselves by oath, not to some crime, but not to commit fraud, theft, or adultery, not falsify their trust, nor to refuse to return a trust when called upon to do so. When this was over, it was their custom to depart again, to assemble again, partake of food, but ordinary and innocent food. What kind of food are they eating? Yeah, according to this, I'm sorry. Ordinary. Yeah, ordinary and innocent food. In a world in which people are talking about eating the body and blood, questions were raised. You can imagine that. And so one of the things that Pliny had politely heard was, they're eating something going on here. And here he goes, hey, they're eating, but it's ordinary and innocent. And it's true. People are saying they're taking an oath. But what kind of oath is it?
Not to do any crime.
Yeah, not to do anything, not to commit fraud or theft or adultery, and that's good. And the third thing he says, which is a little harder for us to understand or to get, he says they are accustomed to meet and sing responsibly a hymn to Christ as to a God. The word hymn there is the Latin word carmen. And the word carmen can be used to refer to him, or can also be used to refer to a magical spell. And so in all three of these cases, what Pliny is doing is saying, you've heard these things, but this is what's going on. It seems to be okay. What does it mean with what shall I come before the Lord? Well, law-abiding elements. The huge reality is it would be fantastic if we had a handbook that described early Christian worship. It would be absolutely fantastic. It just told us details. Just like I think probably many Christians today I hear frequently saying, it would be great if we just had a rule book from Jesus. But unfortunately, he's spoken in parables, and parables can be extremely confusing. So there was a description of a handbook in the 3rd and 4th centuries, but that handbook never turned up, anything like that. And not until the year 1873 was it found. And it was found in Istanbul. A couple of you are going to be going to the church where this was found in January, which is great. And it was a handbook that was found. If you turn to the flip side, it's a handbook that was found. It was found in 1873, but originally came from a manuscript that was from 1071. And originally, it reflects a handbook that was probably around the year 50. It was a handbook that was used probably for Gentiles who were trying to understand what Christianity is about. It's a very simple handbook. And again, it's called the Didache. If you're familiar with the word didactic, which means teaching, that really is all this is. It's the teaching of the 12 apostles. So this handbook was found, and again, it's this exciting moment. It's unclear where it came from. Some people think it came from Alexandria or Egypt originally. Other people think that it came from Antioch, Syria. And again, I think for most of us, at least today, it's like, I don't want to say, can anything good come out of Syria? Possibly coming from Syria. So this is a handbook. The only thing, just for purposes of time, I've included a couple quotations here. I just want to share with you 4 things that I think are unique about this. With what shall I come before the Lord? These are ways in which this handbook is made that makes it more, makes worship Christ-centered. I want to start, though, by just looking at the first passage. There are 2 paths. One path leads to life, one leads to death. There's a great difference between the 2 paths. Now, the path leading to life is this. First, you shall love the God who made you, and your neighbor as yourself. What you do not want someone to do to you, you do not do it to another. What's that sound like? Yeah, it sounds like the Golden Rule. It's the negative formulation of the Golden Rule, which is popularized by it's a very Jewish way of articulating it. Hillel is known for doing this. Yeah, it sounds like the Golden Rule, or some of you might go, hey, it sounds like Proverbs at the beginning, and it should. So it starts in a very Jewish way, but then I just want to say, I guess this is the thesis. There are 4 ways in which this is distinctively Christian. And I'll mention, number 1, it talks about assembling on the Lord's Day. So chapter 14, assemble on the Lord's Day, Sunday. That becomes significant. What's the Sabbath? Sabbath is Saturday. That's what it says. Sabbath is the 7th day of the week. But Christians sort of invented the 2-day weekend. So you still have Sabbath, take that day off, but Sunday is the day when you worship God. They didn't refer, Christians, it's sort of interesting, did not refer to Sunday as the first day of the week, which Jews did. They referred to it as the 8th day of the week, which I think is just absolutely kind of beautiful. It said Christians worship on Sunday because that's the day Jesus was resurrected. And from a Christian perspective, time changed. The fundamental nature of time changed. And so they refer to it as the 8th day of the week. For any of you who've seen the movie, this is Spinal Tap. At a certain point, the musician's adjusting his amplifier, and he says, this is a special amplifier. It goes up to 11. And the guy says, well, why couldn't it just go up to 10 and be calibrated differently? And he goes, this goes up to 11. So calling it the 8th day of the week, very much said, calling it worshiping on Sunday was one way in which worship became more Christian. A second thing is, if you look down at chapter 9, it says, concerning the Eucharist, here's the way you should give thanks. First, concerning the cup, say, we thank you, our Father, for the holy vine of David, your servant, whom you have made known to us, being Jesus Christ, your Son. To you be the glory forever. And what it's doing is it's taking traditional Jewish language and it's pulling Jesus into it. Now, this is unlike some of the language that you may hear in churches today, which is more decisively focused on Jesus. But so the second way in which this becomes Christocentric is it makes meals more Christ-filled. Third way in which I think it becomes Christocentric, again, centered on Christ, is fasting. And I'll just highlight chapter 8. Chapter 8 says, "Do not let your fasting take place at the same time as the hypocrites, for they fast on Monday and Thursday. But as for you, fast on Wednesday and Friday." So for any of you who are fasting today, don't be hypocritical. Fast on Wednesday and Friday. The reason, why do Christians fast on Friday? Yeah. Nope. Nope. I deny you.
Because Jesus died on Friday?
Good, yeah. And some people call it Good Friday, some people call it Black Friday. Yeah, because Jesus died on Friday. That's Friday, fast on Friday. Why on Wednesday? Not Ash Wednesday. It's beautiful though. No. It's actually it's kind of peculiar. It's
Cleansing?
Hump Day, says the Jew. It was because Wednesday of Holy Week is frequently referred to as Spy Wednesday by people other than me. But that's the day when Judas is said to have betrayed Jesus. And so on those 2 days of the week, you don't eat. And then the fourth reason why worship is Christ-centered is grace as a part of this. And I just want to share this with you. I think this is what makes this document kind of fun. I don't want to say funny, but it makes it fun. Is there's grace, there's openness. Let's go to chapter 7. So this is describing what baptism is like. And as you know, there are differences in baptism today. Concerning baptism, immerse yourselves in running water, having first recited all these precepts. Baptize in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. If you do not have running water, immerse in some other water. And if you cannot not immerse in cold water, then baptize in warm water. But if you have neither, pour water 3 times on the head, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Before the baptism, let the person who will perform the baptism and the one who will be baptized fast, and also any others who may be able. And you shall instruct the one who is to be baptized to fast at least 1 or 2 days before. Really? So just do it. And I can say it's grace, but it shows the variety in practice. But what does show a clear sign of grace, I think, is chapter 6. And we're kind of reading this backwards. I just think this is interesting for a religious document. It says, chapter 6, "See to it that no one turns you away from this doctrine concerning the 2 paths. The one who causes you to stray from this teaching does so without God. If you are able to keep the whole yoke of the Lord, you will be perfect. But if you're not able to do so, then do all that you can." So it's a pretty kind of amazing statement. So, with what shall I come before the Lord? People have answered at different times. For the first Christians, I think that we see variety in worship. We see an emphasis or a hope on humility. We see an emphasis on orderliness, and we also see an emphasis on grace. Thanks for your time.
Blink your eyes twice, and you're going to zoom forward a couple hundred years, and Dr. Travis Malone will talk about morality today.
Would you mind grabbing the slideshow for me? Okay, so what is the difference between, for you, the 2 terms education and entertainment? How are those 2 terms different?
I enjoy entertainment.
You enjoy entertainment, okay, all right?
One imparts knowledge.
One imparts knowledge, all right? Okay, it can be entertaining knowledge. Good, other. How do you actively participate in education, or are you here just because you want to be?
I'm here because I'm excited to hear you.
Okay, all right. We've got so we have a mixed between. I want to challenge our ideas and understandings of entertainment and the words education, because specifically the church in the medieval time period did that. They used the forms of entertainment, things that we think about. What makes entertainment? What is something makes something entertaining? Spectacle. Okay, good. What else?
Interesting.
Interesting. All right, good. What else? Comedy. Engaging. What's that mean? What's that engaging? Engaging. Alan, what's that mean?
You're in tune.
Okay, you have a reason to listen, right? There's an exchange going on in an engagement system. when we think about education and the way that we perceive the world, theater historians are really concerned with how we do this, and specifically when we think about medieval history, because I don't know what medieval drama looked like, and there's no one alive today that can tell me that, right? I mean, we can reconstruct a variety of things. So when historians look back in theater history, we're really concerned with not only what the text is that's being performed and what the venue is, the spectacle, the space. We're also concerned with how the audience is engaging with that. So how can we recognize that? We can do this by turning to a variety of things. And recently, the turn in cognitive psychology towards cognitive perception has helped theater historians unlock a lot of ideas and potential meanings in this engagement and interaction. And so I turn first up to looking at the work of George Lakoff, who was the first sort of cognitive psychologist that charted in the brain a system called mirrored neurons. So what do you know about perception? Perception is a variety of neurons that drive your body, correct? You have your cerebral cortex, there are a variety of neurons up there, and they tell your body what to do, how to speak, you make some connections. However, underneath all those neurons is always sitting this group called the subconscious, right? Everyone knows that primarily through Freud. In cognitive psychology, it takes a difference from that. This in subconscious is what helps those neurons connect and fire and make connections between information and parts of your body. George Lakoff discovered that not only do we have neurons that help our body and mind do that, but we have additional neurons that sit side by side that mirror those processes. So when you see someone do something, it lights up your brain the same way it does as if you actually do it. So if I walk over and open the door, your brain says he's opening the door, and I know exactly how to do that. Babies learn how to do this by recognizing. They imitate, right? So we learn through the world by imitating others. We learn and we perceive the world through what we experience. And cognitive psychology has helped us to do that. So, because what we can do in theater history is we can begin to look at these things. We can look at what people write about what they experience. We can see what is happening in the text, and we can look at, and we can start to make some connections, even on a more personal level, without actually sort of having a time machine to be there. Now, I'm going to make some generalizations as I move along. My hope is throughout this talk that it sort of give you some nuggets of information that you might go, hey, I want to Google that. I want to wiki that. I want to learn more about that. So we'll do that as we go along. So we think about the medieval time period, right? The Dark Ages, the system of the feudal lands that propped up. What it really is important to know about this is that if you notice, this is the Demini in northern France. This is an example. So if you look here, this is the township. Oh, one more ahead, Michael. But sneak in, you look at the Lord's Manor House. What else do you see? Church and a parsonage. The only three main permanent structures of the village are those two. So you have not only your Lord, your feudal Lord, but you have the church playing a central role in the whole construction of the village as it moves forward. And what's fascinating about developing civilizations is that we begin to recognize that as civilization gets started, there's an aspect of spirituality that starts, that it gets ritualized. Some of that ritualization is what Dr. Wansink was talking about. How do you, as early Christians, begin to learn to worship? And eventually, out of these ritualizations become even further. You think about expansion, right? The first cell phones were big boxes, right? People carried around big massive antennas, or you had to have them hardwired into your car. Now they're in your pocket. We're talking about sort of progress, make things bigger, better. It's sort of this process of wanting to improve upon and doing that. So in the ancient Greeks, theater sort of develops out of a series of rituals for the god of Dionysus. And the harvest festivals were revolving around that. In ancient India, we see these as we see festivals as well and ritual that evolve into ancient Indian drama. We see the same things in Japan, and we see the same things in feudal Europe. As theater itself in ancient Greece and ancient Rome was dispersed, there's no theaters being built. And instead, the church is using theatrical elements to help educate their masses because there's no books. There's only what you have to go when you go to worship. The priest teaches you Latin, teaches you the ways of measuring, and often most churches in feudal Europe didn't even have a copy of the Bible. They were very precious. So they would learn in monasteries and they would move about. So in order to express themselves and find more ways of gathering folks and finding new ways to express your religion and community, we have to turn to other ideas. So what happens in these You don't have to write all this down. You know when to. It's mostly mobile. As much as nomads move from town to town, distant places. As the feudal lord would conquer the next feudal lord, which would move across. We had the Saxons, the Angles, and the Normans. Everyone's moved across. They would take with them their own expressions, own forms of doing that. So what you have are some leftover remnants. We have parades, we have jugglers, we have mimes. This all started in ancient Rome within this. But what the church begins to understand is that those people come out in masses to watch these. They come out in masses to be entertained, to take a break from their life. So why not take a break from life by worshiping God? Why not develop and fashion festivals to do this? So we're already doing festivals. The Feast of Fools, the Festival of Corpus Christi, several others. So out of this, develop a few other ideas of how to express what we do in a way that does a dual purpose. Entertains our masses as well as educate them in the ideas of the church. And so, as Dr. Billy was talking about in terms of liturgical drama, the chanting and the rituals that came about, they started adding to this. Some of the larger churches actually began adding stories to it, performed stories from the Bible around. And then, if you said the Feast of Corpus Christi is about the crucifixion and ascension of Christ. So, as they go through, they're largely symbolic. But this is our first real brand of true community theater. All townspeople get together. You're going to play Jesus. You're going to play David. We're going to have a Noah. You have some sheep. You'll be a shepherd. Everyone done that in church, right? Some of your churches still do this today. Pageant play it's still a major process in terms of what happens. But in liturgical drama, we get this, and by 1300, these little stages and setup and feasts become more ritualized, more practiced. They become formalized. Monasteries are creating actual texts to send to each of the different parishes from which they could perform. And so what some of these parishes would do in terms of performance is they would use the church as a theater. And literally within the theater they would build stages. You can see starting here, you have the Holy Sepulchre at the end of the church. Right? And at the end of the church, so with the sepulchre is the altar. Most people think about it as the altar as well. And then you have down here, you have the front. So at the front of the house, if we're at the Feast of Corpus Christi, you start in Galilee. And the story of Jesus coming to Galilee and some of his famous teachings. And so these are stages actually set up in the church, performed by townspeople, speaking. And when they would perform, it wasn't just, here it is, they would sort of try to enact who they were, the characters that they were. So if they were Herod, they would act as Herod would. In fact, Who's Raymond talks about the fact that Herod would address people by saying, "Kneel before me." Enacting this tyrant, Pharaoh, kneel down, enacting this tyranny as well. But then you would have Jesus, actually, the person playing Jesus would actually say, "Look upon me." Instead of kneeling down, it's "Look upon my suffering." So there's this difference in character and approach to what the audiences are looking for. So you see, like, those are different, they call them mansions. They did things like that. And then some of these mansions were even put outside. This is from the Valsin's Passion play, which actually tried to and attempted to describe the whole story of Christianity from the fall of Satan to the ascension of Jesus. We're just going to do that in the courtyard in the town center. And so if we go to the next one, some close-ups of these. So you can see here the mouth of hell and Satan and the demons coming forth. You start out with the discussion of God throwing Satan out of heaven and stabbed in hell. So you actually begin a pilgrimage in this process across the hell. You start in hell because we're all original sinners. So we're all starting from sin, and it's a process of moving from stage to stage. We learn more about the Bible, not the way it's spoken in Latin in church, but actual ways of understanding the stories. You see here we have the first set is, remind me where I'm at. You can see Jerusalem is there at the left. So we're through the Old Testament on this side. We have Pharaoh is here. There's a house here for Pharaoh. Right, so we're enacting the Old Testament stories, moving along. And the audience would go from stage to stage and see these little episodes. It's like watching a whole season of your favorite Big Bang Theory, right? But you do it and doing it as you walk along, right? So we get to a climax. The idea of you're bringing to a climax, right? The best part about this, that Jesus ascended to heaven and that we are redeemed through Christ's love. So as he moves along, audiences move along, you have to get to a variety of places. You get to the Temple Mount. Jesus talking about the temple. We get to Nazareth, the birth, and we get to Nazareth and the actual crucifixion here, right here. And if this picture were to go further, the next building after this is the church. So you start in hell, you pilgrimage your way through the Bible and the stories of the Bible, and you end up at the church for services in the feast of this. So it not only serves as sort of education, but an active embodiment. And what's also really important about, as we look at how it's embodied looking through, we know a variety of things about playwrights. The first female dramatist that we can find on record at this point is a Roswitha, a nun, a German nun who wrote a number of liturgical dramas. You probably know them. You probably have them on your bookshelf. There's Abraham, Dulcitius, Gallicanus, Aphanitus, Septentia. If you know who Terence is a Roman comic playwright. So we have a German nun writing liturgical drama based in Roman comedy and developing those and saying about. So we have comedy, we have spectacle, we have these ideas of engagement, but more importantly, underlying everything is the educational process. And watching your townspeople go through what each one of the specific stories of the Bible did enacted those mirror neurons. And if we look back to cognitive psychology, what sort of assumptions are you going to make? If you watch your mayor beat himself as Jesus, in essence,
You're going to want to start being like Jesus.
well, you're going to feel that pain without actually doing it, right? The mirror neurons are going to fire in your brain, and you're going to feel that. So what cognitive psychology does is it gives us a chance to understand why theater makes us feel, even more so than film or literature. Because it is actually the physical presence and the interaction between physical presences that creates an even larger firing of those mirror neurons. So is Roswitha. But what we do also know is that these liturgical dramas are so ritualized, so present, so straight, that eventually at some point there's going to be a rebel that's going to break things down. Or there's going to be a parish that doesn't have a church big enough to fit 7 stages. There's a lot of those parishes in Northern Europe. So as we begin to look, so what do they begin to do? They begin to take these cycles back out into the streets, and they begin to do what they have been doing for a while, which is using what they have around them to make these festivals. So out of these, they started developing actual plays and cycles of plays based on this idea of stages, education, and moving about. This time, though, we'll devise wagons. We'll make stages that move around the city square. You can do that. And what's really important is that mystery is in early French, English. The idea of mystery is not actually like, ooh, scary, don't know the answer. It's actually sort of like ministry, answering questions, giving information. So what happens is that these feasts go around, they start developing. So they use things like movable stages, pageant wagons. They performed in the costumes they had at hand. And then often, since these were feasts that happened every year, they would take their wagons they already used, they used every day, but we would just augment them. We'd add decorations to them. We'd store the decorations in the church, and we'd pull them out. We have one person called a pageant master that would actually organize it every year, sort of like a director. Sort of like someone who's at church that is it the youth pastor that does the Christmas service, or is it the drama minister? Those ideas. But what we have throughout is a spectacle, and now we have moving spectacle that's at your door. These pageants go through, these wagons move through your town. So here's some examples of these type of pageants in some of the larger cities. This is from the Wakefield Cycle, very famous English cycle play that is actually still performed today. The longest running sort of cycle play still. But you can see how elaborate and ornate they were, especially in large cities where there was a lot of money. Pageant master was oftentimes one of the more wealthy members. He was sort of the patron of the pageant itself. They would pay for it. I say he because it wasn't a woman. No offense. Within that. So you can see. But what do you notice about these wagons? They're covered, bottoms are covered, right? They're really tall, they're elevated, so you can fit hundreds of people around them to watch these. You have imprisonment, you have very lavish costumes. And we'll go on to the next one. And then if you're in a local parish, it probably looks a little something more like this. Like your grade school painted cardboard set and a little less ornate. But what we still have is a covered wagon, an elevated stage, and more importantly, we actually have a top to it as well. And there's lots of descriptions of these pageants and lots of descriptions of the set because spectacle was absolutely important. So demons could come up from underneath the wagon, trapdoors. You could store stuff underneath these wagons, both form and function. But also that third story served as places for angels to come, meet the shepherds, and see those. And so it's the idea that you're standing around watching these events. You don't know how to read. I don't know, but the church is sanctioning these. And they're delivering the message of the church through theater and performance. So, Jody Anders, really phenomenal theater scholar, looks at theater morality. And so when you think about people enacting Christ being whipped, you enact any of these number of slavery, those aspects, there were times, and there are descriptions of this, where actors crossed the line. They literally penanced themselves in public, opening themselves up, bleeding from being whipped, and that there was sort of in some descriptions a badge of honor. It's sort of, I can show how much I love God more than the next pageant, and sort of in that retrospect. But she actually talks about the fact that when we look at the perception of truth in regards to medieval theater, that it's actually on 3 levels. First is invencio, the fact that we have the impossible, the spiritual belief being made manifest in a physical presence in front of us, breaks down a wall. It opens up a doorway into understanding and perception of especially spirituality. We have memoria. We do know in theater as well, we call it phenomenology, the idea that it's ephemeral. When you see something, it sticks in your mind. And then you go home and you rehearse that. Think about the fact that you have a favorite song. If you have a favorite song, right? I've listened to it like 20 times. Why? Why do you do that? What are you doing in reminding and doing that? Are you reenacting that first moment? It made you feel something really exciting. I connected to it emotionally. But you can, and the human mind does this. And so we replay these events over and over and over. And then finally, when you see it in the physical being, it hyper-reinforces. So if we connect Anders' idea with mirror neurons, right? The idea, it gives us an idea of why. When I see something live, it makes my body, it gives me a body and a visceral reaction that I am reminded of and enact over and over and over. Every time I think about seeing something being whipped, that's the image. And the image can then be connected to what I should be doing after I see Christ ascend, right? What should I go do? Remember my pilgrimage? Where do I go? Church. So we're actually, through theater and spectacle, embodying a sense of ritual and education in that. We're educating them in the actual rituals of worship and what you do in that respect. So, let me just give you a quick little guide to medieval drama. So when you walk away and go, oh yeah, I can go to my bookshelf, I'll pick these right up. This is one of the most popular ways every minute. It's a morality play. The most prominent, anyone know what the most prominent dramatist of the medieval theater is? No, it's Renaissance. Try though. Anonymous. Fabulous author. We don't know. We're anonymous. Yeah, he's one of the most famous playwrights of all time. He wrote a lot of things, and I don't know how he did it over so many years. But what we do know is that, and the reason it's anonymous is a lot of these things are picked up and ritualized. So a town may find this as an idea, a plot. They will do it differently in their town as someone else, and eventually it gets written down. Eventually it gets put somewhere, and eventually it ends up in a book, and then we all start studying it as truth. But in all honesty, there were probably many versions of this story. The story's pretty simple. Satan challenges God to find one good man on the planet. Man, sorry ladies. Man on the planet. And so God shows him every man. And Satan's job then is to try and prove that every man is not a good man. And so he sends the 7 deadly virtues in human form to tempt him. Variety of things. Lust, greed, sloth, as they go through. Every man does not. In fact, along the way, he helps the poor. He does a lot of actions that you should be doing as a good person, a good Christian, as the teachings of Jesus states. So he is redeemed at the end. He greets death and is allowed to go to heaven with the angels at the end of the play. Now, what really is important is he's enacting morality. Here we have again an actual play now that enacts the morality that has been ritualized through society and through those aspects. So every man, and that's a story we all know about, right? And it picks up, and we see this in a lot of different forms. We have every man meeting death. These are medieval drawings of the time period. So we know that this happened a lot in a lot of different places because we have artwork popping up all over Europe. Different depictions of death and every man together. So it's really impossible to sort of pin down exactly where this comes out. You have other representations that show how it's been unfolded. So this is just a version of a pageant wagon. Elevated stage, every man performing on it. And we could actually even want to move, we can move around, we can move from wagon to wagon, and in fact we could follow every man. Some descriptions of the cycle play says that there were several stages for each of the different virtues, and that the crowd literally followed every man to each stage, following through life, enacting through physical action this ritual of penance, performance, and even to some degree teaching them how to avoid falling into sin as they go. Second one that comes about is more for the popular side. This one's called the Second Shepherd's Play. And this rises in England, this script itself. And the Second Shepherd's Play is much more a play for the masses. I think every man is sort of like really serious broad, but this is like for you guys. This is like we're going to pitch something here for BWC now. We're going to do Second Shepherd's Play. So we come up with this idea. We're going to talk about the birth of Jesus, but I want to give it a little bit of a spin. Anachronistic. You know what that means? Sort of like when we watch Mel Brooks films, right? You know, they're kind of set in a period or a place, but then there's all these contemporary references. Scary Movie kind of does that too, right? That's kind of what Second Shepherd's Play does. So we start off, the angel appears to the shepherds and says, behold, Jesus has been born in a manger and you should go see him. And so they go. They go to Nazareth. Not really Nazareth, it's actually the town that you're living in. So it's not. So there's even a confusion of place. And you're watching your fellow classmates do this. So they show up at a house and it's run by Mac and his wife. Mac has a very nagging wife. She's only interested in the farm, only interested in making money and a good life for themselves. Mac's kind of this downtrodden guy. He wants to do good, but can't help it. And so these shepherds show up, and they're kind of exotic. They're from out of town. They have money. Well, they can help us. They can give us more things. So Mac and his wife get an idea. We'll pretend that our baby goat is Jesus. And then they can give us the presents that they're going to give Jesus.
Oh, God.
So, and that's kind of funny, right? Because, and then there's this whole scene. They bring out a goat, and it'd be wrapped up in a blanket. And it's, oh, isn't it cute? It's so hairy. What's up? And so there's really great dialogue and discussion. But as they understand it, they really see that it's a goat. Mac comes clean. They're really only trying to make it. So they all agree to go see, and the angel appears and says, it's actually just 2 doors down. So if y'all just go 2 doors down, you'll see the newborn king. And the idea is that the shepherds aren't mad at Mac. And in fact, they show mercy. They say, why don't you come join us and worship with us? Enacting a presence, a sense of mercy and justice, a social justice that goes beyond taking Mac to the town square, locking him up, and throwing rotten fruit at him, which is what they would have done if he was really trying to commit fraud in medieval Europe. So it is a little bit sort of counterculture to some degree, that the church be a little subversive over what we consider social order by enacting this sort of idea that you can be just by allowing yourself to do that. So as you begin to think about anything you sort of take away and you begin to think about, I want you to think about why, if you go to see a show or you do whatever you watch in culture, what do you think about the idea that somewhere in your mind Those mirror neurons are firing, just like they would have been in medieval Europe. What are you allowing yourself, and what does your subconscious do to the world and your understanding of the world by experiencing? And at some point, just as in medieval Europe, and my classes generally hear me say this a lot, there is very little line between education and entertainment. At some point, you're being educated. And we kind of think about education as always being this high, lofty thing. But sometimes education can be something completely contrary to what you're... And it is all about sort of presence and understanding of how space, our own rituals, our own actions help us re-embody, continue to perpetuate, and begin to shape the way we understand and continue to perpetuate our understanding through the world as we move forward. So everyone go pick up a copy of Second Chapter of Plan. Every man read it in the old English. It's exceptionally intriguing. But I would prefer questions, or Dr. Wansink or myself. But then like one quick one, I think, don't we now?
And if you're too nervous about how you get out of the room, we'll just ask these two to stand up there, and if you have a question, you can grab them. And these two are on the front, but take a chair with them when they go to clear the aisle.